Can you become a successful artist at the highest level without going to a school, without getting other people to give you feedback and critique? Yes and no. On the one hand, I think that it's vital to get feedback from the world to let us know how we're going. On the other hand, I think that you can never rely on another human being to care about your art as much as you do and to know where you want to go with it. At some point, you need to get good at giving yourself critiques, at figuring out where you want to go, at taking this into your own hands. In this video, I want to discuss how to do that and how to think about it. Let's get started. Alright, my name's Tim McBurney and I've been a professional artist for 20 years and a professional drawing teacher for 10 years, and I'm here to help you draw cool stuff from your imagination, to embrace the challenge of drawing, and to master the craft of line and color illustration. Now, I made a video about setting art goals recently, and I'll link to it in the description and hopefully have a link somewhere on the page, somewhere on the screen that sort of pops up so you can check it out. In it, I talked about how to think about giving yourself motivation and how to set goals, potentially for a New Year's resolution, but just in general at any time when you're feeling a little bit lost as an artist. I think it's important to do this at regular intervals, and again, especially when you're feeling as if you don't know the way forward. This got me thinking about how I could share some similar thoughts on giving yourself critique and guidance. I want to go through a similar process that I talked about in that video for my own work from the previous year. Essentially just doing what I said that should be done. And through doing this, I'm going to share how, I would go over my progress and try to figure out sort of what to focus on next. What's next for me and how do I think about that? And how does this concept tie into the idea of giving yourself critique, right? And taking control of your own artistic destiny. If you're interested in improving your illustration and you want some advice for tackling your own artistic journey, check out my free illustration mini workshop. In it, I share with you some thoughts on illustration and how best to improve and think about getting professional work. There'll be a link for that in the description. Go check it out. Okay, so I do a lot of career guidance and portfolio mentorship with students because, one of my hobbies is teaching drawing. And when we do those, I do a lot of discussing how to improve images and round out people's skill sets. Often people in that instance are looking for professional work and, they're trying to figure out sort of how to get that portfolio rounded out. And I think that there's a huge benefit from engaging in artists who are further along in their artistic journey than you are. It's very easy for a trained eye to spot where you're deficient and where you can easily make huge gains just by focusing on a particular area. For instance, one of the major things that I always see in people who are sort of on that cusp of working professionally, they're working on their folio and, they're trying to sort of figure that stuff out, is that there's a real need to work on secondary form, right? Again, I talk about that quite a bit in that free mini workshop that I mentioned, and this is for a reason, right? It's something I see coming up again and again and again. It's something that's sort of super valuable, and in my experience, the artists who are experiencing that can't see it. They can't see that that is the major thing sort of holding them back. And that's an instance where, again, because I've sort of been there before and I can kind of see where they're struggling, it's easy for me to see, hey, this is what you're missing, if you just work on this, trust me, it'll sort of help. So, I do think that there's a huge benefit for getting someone with a trained eye to have a look at your work and, see what they can see. I got a lot of really useful feedback on art forums in the early days of the internet. Again, I'm a little bit older and, when I was sort of coming up, there weren't a lot of YouTube videos like this. There wasn't any sort of video on the internet really, and all of that was done through sort of art forums. And I don't really think that I would be here without that. I think I was in a very privileged position to be around at that specific time and take advantage of what was happening then. I think my first post on an art forum actually got a reply from Craig Mullins, the talented Ron Lemon, and the late Francis Tsai, all of whom were working professionals at the top of their game at the time. And over the years, they helped me a lot just by sort of giving me free advice on art forums. But I also learned to do a lot of self-critique, or at least a lot of self-directed guidance. Again, I was living in a fairly small sort of city in Australia where there weren't a lot of sort of physical resources for me. So I sort of had to use the internet and use my own ability to sort of do that. And I think this idea of figuring out how we can give ourselves some directed guidance is really important. It's important to take advice on, but at some point you have to figure out what you're actually going to do with it too. You have to make a plan and understand what's being said. Otherwise, you can get great advice and ignore it. I did a lot of ignoring great advice in my time, and I think, again, that's just one of the challenges, figuring out who to listen to. Do they actually know where I want to go with my work? And that's why, again, formalizing some of these plans and making them visual is really useful. One of the reasons that I tell people to make influence maps, which again is something I talk about in the setting goals video, is because influence maps allows you to easily engage another drawing professional or someone, again, who is further along in their artistic journey and say, this is where I want to go. Can you use that information to kind of maybe give me some advice on how to get there? As opposed to, again, just giving people some random sort of, can you help me get better question? It's really important to have a good solid understanding of where you want to go. It'll help you and it'll help other people. So even though I ignored a lot of great advice in my time, hindsight is always 20/20. The bottom line is that developing your own ability to critique and give yourself tasks for improvement is key to developing as an artist. We always have feedback, right? It could be from a teacher or an art director or a client you're working with, depending on where you are on your artistic journey, whether you are just beginning and again at a school or something, or whether you've been working and you're getting feedback from a team or from a client you're working with. But it's always our job to make that feedback count, to take the advice that maybe other people are giving us and also our own goals and aspirations and to make something of that so that we can move forward. This is obviously a long and detailed subject. What I want to do is talk about how I try to sort through these things, figure out what's working and what's not working in my art, and to give myself things to focus on going forward. Step 1, collect and collate. We need to track and we need to analyze. Here are all the images that I sort of found on my hard drive that were created in the previous time period. In my video on goals, I talked about there being 3 main steps to think about. The first is figuring out where we are or where we have been, essentially what is the current state of our art. And then secondly, to figure out where you want to go. What are our goals and aspirations that we want to head towards going forward? And then thirdly, to make a simple plan with measurable steps or goals, or to sort of give ourselves tasks, something measurable that we can actually do. So to figure out what the state of things are for me, again, I've collected these images, and these are images that I've completed sort of in the previous year. And the goal here is to see what can be divined by sorting through them. Obviously, this is going to be somewhat indulgent for me and focused on my goals. Your goals will be very different. The point of this video is to share how I would go about doing this so that hopefully you can learn something from my process here. Overall, it's worth mentioning sort of where I am in general, right? Not just sort of this year, but in sort of my journey overall and the things that I've been focusing on. Over the last few years, I've really been trying to simplify my style and develop my ability to work with flat color instead of rendering everything. This is mostly so I can try to work on some more comic book projects that I have planned for the future. The other reason for this is that I'd often look back at my work and notice that the stuff that was better designed but had simple rendering was often the most effective, and it also printed really well. So this is where I'd be looking back at my books, and I kind of see stuff that, I'd sort of done a long time ago, but because it had a little bit of a better design and a simplicity to it, I felt that often it was sort of more effective, and I'd look back at that and say, well, that's old, but it's kind of better than some of the stuff that I was doing. And I often found that I was also becoming a little bit reliant on sort of rendering to make things interesting, and it was an exercise in creative restriction to try and just focus on this idea of flat color, simple line work. Also, a lot of my favorite artists use a simpler approach like this, and I think it also allows me to put more time into the drawing, and that in the interest of efficiency, which to me is really important for comics, because I'm sort of generally more interested in drawing more and creating more over the long term. I feel that it also allows me essentially to produce a better image overall, because if you think about having a limited amount of time, which is always the case with comics, if I spend more time on the drawing and less time kind of, sort of re-rendering things by trying to sort of add a lot of lighting and effects and shading, that again, I felt like that was a good restriction, and it forced me to make good decisions about just everything that I was doing. And so I've been working on that overall, and I found that, again, it has sort of allowed me to do what I was sort of trying to do there. It's allowed me to focus more on design and simple color choices, and again, avoid getting a little bit sort of lost and muddy with rendering. So at least this has been something I've been chewing on and working towards over the last few years. I probably arrived at this realization and sort of my attempt to try and do this using a similar process to what I'm doing right now. I often try and work towards these sorts of goals to help round out my skill set. So probably before I was doing this, I actually was doing the exact opposite. I was spending a lot of my time trying to learn how to sort of paint without lines, which is pretty much the exact opposite approach altogether. So it's not always about what's right or what's better. It's what about sort of I see as the next thing that I want to do. I also spent, a large sort of, chunk of time really, really working on my technical drawing, for instance, where, I wasn't really being quite so creative. I was really just trying to understand, perspective and traditional rendering and getting as sort of technical as I can. And again, that's not always the best way to draw. It often lacks emotion, but I felt doing that helped round out my skill set overall. So again, these are sort of the large waves of sort of focus that, I might sort of focus on over, sort of 3 or 4 years at a time. So anyway, these images that we can see here are things that I created this year. These are essentially all personal pieces or ones created for tutorials or teaching. I do these because it's what I've sort of always done. When I was coming up, as I said, I'd be on art forums, and you just kind of create images so you'd sort of have something to post. That's really just what I've sort of always done. And even though, again, I have a full-time freelance schedule and, I fit these in around that, it's something that, again, it always just sort of makes me happy as a creative outlet to do these kind of personal pieces. Again, there's a mix of other things in there, like some of these sort of comic book projects there. Again, these are all just sort of essentially things that I'm doing in my spare time. Sometimes there's thought put in, sometimes I'm just sitting down after my other work and I'm sort of seeing what happens. There's not necessarily any goal in mind for all of them, it's just sort of a mix. I haven't included any of the professional work I did this year. I don't feel that it's ethical to include freelance work in this kind of process, as there I'm focusing on the needs of my clients or the teams I'm working with, and my goal there is to make their life easier and help the project we're working on be the best it can be. I don't do any of this sort of self-indulgent, sort of retrospective narcissism in that instance. I do similar stuff for my freelance work, or when I think about how to sort of move forward and potentially get sort of different projects going forward, but that would be a subject of a different video. So in terms of tracking progress, the second thing, and seeing if I'm getting better or improving, I feel that I am sort of getting better at doing some of these things. If we dig a little bit deeper, I feel that there's quite a few images here that do achieve what I have sort of been trying to, get better at, which is making things simpler. I think these images here that you can see are probably pretty good examples of that. A simpler style, not as much rendering, and focusing a little bit more on creating interesting scenes and interesting ideas. Now, a big part of this period of time was actually spent developing this YouTube channel and my teaching site, the Drawing Codex, and building some new courses. So while I did create a bit of work for those, not a lot of it was really focused on my goals. It was more in service of those tutorials. So overall, I didn't create that much sort of personal work this year. But I do feel like these images here were successful, and I felt like they did what I was wanting. If we look at some of the comics that I was doing, I had a few comic book projects that were planned for the year that would have taken up most of my sort of freelance time and my professional sort of time. And they kind of ended up not happening for a variety of reasons. I spent a lot of my personal time earlier in the year working on some test pages to prepare myself for the schedule, which would have been pretty intense if I was to sort of take on all of those projects. And my goal was to see what I could get done in the time I thought I had available. There were no stories for these. I was just trying some sort of freeform stuff because I thought it might sort of turn out okay. And really, I wasn't too worried about it because I thought at any moment I'd sort of be thrown into a full-time sort of, comic book schedule anyway. So these didn't really go anywhere, and I felt that this energy could have been better directed, and really I should have known better than sort of, trusting that those projects would go ahead. Because again, a lot of projects just sort of don't go ahead for a variety of reasons. I ended up doing a bunch of other stuff, which has actually been very, very, very interesting. In terms of output, if I look at the things I did, which I look at now and I'm proud of, it's these larger images. It's where I'm sort of creating the scenes. That's where I always sort of, I can sort of look back and say, hey, that was kind of cool. That was interesting. These are the things that I feel like were more successful, as I said. Things that were sort of less successful were where I was maybe getting a little bit indulgent with maybe modifying my style. I was, trying to redraw some of the characters, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute. But again, I was sort of just sort of playing around and not really being focused. And again, that sort of thing seems like it was kind of fun at the time. But now that I look back on it, I'm like, that was a bit of a waste of time, and I didn't really get as much out of it. Similar to that would be, again, playing around with some sort of different styles, and I had a bunch of different things I was trying to achieve, none of which are really worth talking about. Maybe trying to get a little bit more of sort of a watercolor, much, much simpler kind of look, and again, I feel like that was a bit of a miss, and just wasn't really pushing me in the direction that I know I need to go. So again, those were things that I felt like were a little bit less successful. The point there is that, again, as I was doing them, I can sort of look back and say, hey, this was an interesting experiment. I was sort of playing around with drawing a character that I'd already created. And I thought, well, hey, what if I did it this way? What if I did it that way? What if I tried to refine the design a bit? Maybe I could sort of, redraw this book or do a different sort of book, but, give it a slightly less kind of cartoony sort of feel. And again, those things seemed fun at the time, and, that was sort of interesting. But again, when I view them in the context of my overall goals, I think it was a miss. So if we take all of these images and sort of, again, spill the tea leaves out and try and divine some guidance to analyze things, I think I've gotten where I want to go with my attempt to solidify a style of comic book pages that sort of does what I want. Again, this is the similar sort of style that you can see both in some of these comic book pages and some of the images here. This look is actually very similar to the first book I ever drew, the Seven Pirates book. That book really had like pretty simple flat color for the most part, And the goal really here needs to be to implement this look going forward. I feel like I've experimented and played around with a lot of different styles in comic books. And again, this is really what I'm interested in at the moment, and that's what I want to do. Now, not related to the art specifically, but linked to these issues, I want to make a new book, and I want to try doing it digitally as a webcomic, or at least make that part of the process initially. I think that the future of comics is digital. It's going to be on tablets and iPads. I don't know why this hasn't happened yet already. The global industry still seems to be stuck in print, but I guess I really feel like it has to flip at some point, as it sort of has with ebooks for independent publishers. Ultimately, I think that it will be important to control publishing rights when this does happen, as I feel the market will allow skipping publishers in favor of marketplaces in a similar way to ebooks on, the Amazon Marketplace function now. Something else I noticed this year as a process of redrawing some of my past characters, we can see that again here. And I did this a little bit for the channel when I was drawing some of my Pinocchio characters that you might have seen me create some videos for, and redrawing some of these characters from the Ara book that I drew, is that it's really nice to be able to just draw something without designing on the fly. I've been doing a lot of this lately, right? Just sort of designing stuff as I go. And the characters which I feel like worked out well and were well designed ended up being really fun. They were a pleasure to draw. Some of the ones that, didn't get designed well for drawing in comics were surprisingly annoying to redraw. So the ones that I feel like were successful designs, I'd redraw the Ara character and I'm like, this works quite well. I sort of fell out of, habit drawing it, but, when I went back to it, it was sort of very easy, and I felt it kind of worked well. Some of the other ones, like the Maluk character, again, it was very challenging for me to go back and remember the design and redraw it. I feel like it was always a struggle, and this is something, again, that kind of nags at me. And when I look at this and sort through the tea leaves here, I kind of see this as a pattern emerging. I feel like this character really never worked that well in 3 dimensions. And if we look at the cover for the Ara book, I feel like, again, this character just never really worked that well. It was very tricky for me to track the character and the emotions and get him sort of acting in 3 dimensions. I feel like a lot of the structure just never really worked. It worked as a sketch, but again, I never really figured it out. Ara's horns, for instance, were a little bit of a pain to draw. And these rings here, even though they don't seem that bad, this actually just probably took up a huge amount of drawing time for no real reason. So again, it made me sort of realize and reassess that a really, really good comic book character needs to be fun to draw. This is a concept that's been in my head for ages, and one of the things that I think I've always sort of talked about and strived for, but again, it's sort of realizing where that sort of fell short and how important it is, and this is something I really want to work on going forward. Another thing here that is a little bit harder to illustrate, but something I feel that is holding back the books that I sort of want to create, is that often, I notice the secondary characters that I'm designing are designed as a little bit of an afterthought. I think that I'm probably jumping into these projects without doing enough real design work early on. This is something that, again, probably I could get away with when I was doing books earlier on. But, I spent a lot of time working as a professional designer, creating characters, weapons, tech, guns, backgrounds, and working in different styles for different projects, doing feature animation, stylized sci-fi games, fantasy games. I've done a huge amount of actual design work where we really dig in and do all this stuff. And I always sort of thought that, again, that was something that was important to me. But what I've really realized is I don't actually spend enough time doing that, doing a similar process for my own projects. Now, the reason for that is that I felt that often people get trapped in the world building phase of their projects, and they don't really ever get off the ground and start making stuff. And to be honest, there's no need to do a huge amount of pre-production and pre-development work in comics. You don't get paid extra for it. and B, a lot of it exists in the author's mind. But I really have analyzed a lot of the stuff that I've been doing, and I really think that there's probably a nice middle ground in there where I can sort of design visually out a lot of those things that need to be designed so they are more unique and they are more interesting, and that I'm not just kind of doing cookie cutter secondary characters and cookie cutter environments. I think to solve this, I don't need to spend ages rendering finished images or designing things in some fancy way, but coming up with consistent visual design language and spending more time on secondary characters is something I really want to work on going forward. Again, this doesn't need to be finished or formalized in any way. I just need to make sure it's actually done. So the next step that I talked about is essentially to figure out where we want to go. This is where we need to figure out where we're headed and what direction we want to go with our art. Now, you could make an influence map for this, but in my case, I think I've spent a lot of time focused on external references, probably too much of that already last year. To a certain degree, I feel like that might have been the problem, jumping around a little bit too much. And I'm mostly this year interested in designing and filling images with stories and more interesting content. So it's these images here that I have sort of pointed to that I feel like are really sort of where I want to move in terms of the overall sort of style and image and technique. What I need to do is not really focus on this too much more. What I need to do instead, as I said, is to really double down on creating more original characters, which are sort of true characters. So, secondary characters and original characters, and more interesting objects and worlds that are actually linked to a story and mean something, where the designs are evolved and refined and will, stand up to redrawing, which I think is, again, sort of something that I want to do. This goes hand in hand with writing, and I think, again, as I said, this can extend beyond just simple characters, right? Anything that we can think about as being needed to produce a book or a story can sort of go into that bucket. I have a few projects that don't really look like anything I've drawn before that I really want to work on, and they need a proper design path. I don't want to fall into the trap of world building, as I said, because again, I think that can be an excuse for not actually just making finished products. But I did notice when I was, starting to, work on these sort of comic projects, that one of the things I was running into is that I just would go to draw secondary characters and background characters, and I'd feel like they just weren't fleshed out. They weren't interesting enough, and the same would go for some of the environments. And I felt like that was something that I needed to resolve. So one of the things I'm going to consciously orient away from, because again, a big part of this is not just what are we aiming for, but part of that is what are we aiming away from. So I'm going to consciously orient away from exploring style and learning new techniques for the next period. I feel like this is something, as I said, that I was playing around with a little bit, and it was often the result of stuff that I look back on and I'm like, why did I do that? That really didn't turn out that well. It was exciting at the time, but not actually that valuable going forward. Now, the final step is to actually try and write out some goals and make a plan which is measurable. This is something that can be tricky. A good technique here is to write out a bunch of things and really brainstorm and explore different ways to tackle these issues. I don't want to waste that time so much. I think that could be a half an hour exercise in itself. So I'm going to focus on the key points I've mentioned, again, because I've sort of done a little bit of this work already, and I want to sort of cut to the chase. But I really do recommend spending the time to brainstorm that out, because it gives you a lot of different ideas to draw from. The main thing, as I said, that I want to do is more design work. But I don't want this to be too fancy. It's mostly about designing things which are fun to draw, and I can do this in my sketchbook. I haven't been doing a lot of this work lately. I haven't been spending a lot of time in that sketchbook, and again, that's something I kind of noticed through looking at this. And that's mostly because I enjoy creating these finished images. I've been drawing also a lot on loose paper. So when I have been sketching, I've been doing it just on loose bits of copy paper, because I find that's really good for not worrying about whether we ruin a sketchbook or something. But I have found over the years that loose bits of paper are really hard to find and access, whereas I have sketchbooks on a shelf lined up that I've done years ago, and I can kind of look back at them, and it's very easy, right? I've got all those books, everything I ever did in a sketchbook, I can pick it up and look at it. Whereas I've got piles and piles and piles of paper that I've drawn on, and it's just a complete mess. It's mixed up with notes and other things, and I tend to just not file it, and there's no way I can really think of to solve that problem. So I'm starting to prefer the idea of only sketching in sketchbooks for this reason. This might end up costing more money and might end up with some sort of rough, sketchy pages that don't turn out well, some wasted space, but I think overall this is something I really want to work on. Again, is being able to look back at those things, especially if they are sort of designs that I'm going to be referencing, and sort of not worry about losing them. So as I mentioned in the video about goals, it's important to avoid making vague art goals like do more sketching or design more interesting characters. That's just not going to cut it. I'm going to try for 2 very specific goals and see how they go. The first is to create a unique personal design each week. Again, just with sketches, it can be rough, but this will be done in my spare time, obviously. And the goal here is just to design things for specific characters from things that I'm writing, but I need to get them to a point where the design is actually functional and I'm ready for that to just go into a book, right? Which again is quite a specific design task, but again, I think it's that specificity helps. The second is to complete 1 sketchbook per month to try and, define how much of this am I actually going to do. And this will either be a sort of single A4 or 8 by 11 inch sketchbook, and that'll sort of have about 160 pages or 80 sheets for that size. Or there's another sketchbook size that has 96 pages or 48 sheets. And that one is 11 by 14 inches or a little bit more, like that sort of A3 size. So I'll see how that goes. Again, this is not something I'm going to go crazy over. Whether I do that amount of sketching is not really going to make or break it. But that, I feel like, is the sort of pace and the scale that I need to work on to kind of give me the interest and the focus to do that. I think it should be pretty easy to achieve those goals for the most part. Keep in mind, a big part of setting goals for me, as I said earlier, has as much to do with what not to do as it has with what to do. It's easy to get sidetracked. It's certainly very easy for me to get sidetracked, mid-year, or to forget why I'm doing something like filling a bunch of sketchbooks. If I have perhaps a bad week or a bad day, it's easy to switch tasks and feed the ego. If I can't reconnect with the why and the why it's going to help me to focus on this and troubleshoot the issues that come up, it's very easy for me to just go and switch gears, right? To just do something else, right? Again, if I encounter friction, often just having these goals and understanding them and writing that down gives me the impetus to kind of say, look, I'm gonna fix whatever's going on here, as opposed to just kind of following the muse a little bit more and sort of doing what's fun. Anyway, that's all I've got here. Hopefully that sort of makes sense. Let me know if you found this useful. Hopefully it can shed some light on how I do what I actually suggested in that goals video. And you can see how I'm still adjusting and having to focus and refocus myself after doing this for years. Also keep in mind that, I very often do this kind of thing just in my head as I scroll through stuff I've done in the past. I actually export a JPEG of every sort of bit of art I make into a single folder, and I can scroll through, that sort of history and sort of check that stuff out pretty easily. But I do find that writing it down and making a public video about it does really help to clarify things in my mind. So while we don't always need to be, hyper anal retentive about this and making lists and being analytical, again, I feel like that is often antithetical to the artistic ethos. I do think it really does sort of help, right? It can help now and then to do it. The key is to stay focused on where you want to go with your art and to take that destiny into your own hands. Happy drawing. Catch you later.